June 7, 1992, Springfield, Missouri. After an evening of partying following their high school graduation, 19-year-old Suzie Streeter and 18-year-old Stacy McCall go to spend the night at Suzie's house alongside Suzie's 47-year-old mother, Sherrill Levitt. Later that morning, Suzie, Stacy, and Sherrill, a.k.a. the Springfield Three, are all discovered to be missing from the residence. The scene contains some bizarre clues, including a broken globe for the porch light and an odd answering machine message, which is inadvertently erased, but no hard evidence about what might have happened. Over the years, there would be a number of leads, such as a convicted criminal who claimed to know what happened to the victims, but no trace of the Springfield Three is ever found. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our 3-year anniversary show of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we are going to be covering a very famous and highly requested missing persons case, which was voted on by you, the listeners. The disappearances of Suzie Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Sherrill Levitt, more commonly known as the Springfield Three. Yes, it's hard to believe that The Trail Went Cold has made it to its 3rd anniversary, as it feels like we just started this podcast yesterday. That voice you just heard narrate our intro was Anna Long, the winner of this month's Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, and she did a tremendous job, so thank you very much, Anna. For the past year and a half, this has been a popular recurring monthly contest, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, the Springfield Three is considered to be one of the most baffling and haunting missing persons cases of the modern era, and ever since I made reference to it in our 2nd episode, which covered the disappearance of the Fort Worth Three, I've been getting requests to cover it on the podcast. It's become a tradition for me to hold a poll for our anniversary show each year, in which listeners can vote on which case they'd like to see featured on the episode, and while it was a close race this time around, it doesn't surprise me too much that the Springfield Three wound up being the winner. The reason this story has always struck such a chord is because it involves 3 people vanishing without a trace from a house in the middle of the night. However, there were no signs of any struggle or evidence that an intruder had been inside the house, so if these 3 women were abducted, how did the perpetrator or perpetrators manage to pull it off? There have been a lot of potential leads in this case over the past 2 decades, and the most infamous involves a rumor that the victims are buried underneath the parking garage of a local hospital, so you can be sure I'll be addressing that in this episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of the Springfield Three. Our story begins in Springfield, Missouri in 1992. Our 3 central figures, more commonly known as the Springfield Three, are 47-year-old Sherrill Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter Suzie Streeter, who goes by the name Suzie, and Suzie's friend, 18-year-old Stacy McCall. Sherrill originally hails from Seattle, and in addition to Suzie, she also has a son named Bart, who is 9 years older than his sister. Shortly after Suzie was born, Sherrill divorced her children's father, Brent Streeter, who pretty much stayed out of their lives. Sherrill took her 2 children and moved to Springfield in 1980, and subsequently got married to another man named Don Levitt. The couple divorced in 1989, but this wound up having a negative impact on Sherrill's finances, since Don's creditors eventually started contacting her about paying back debts that he owed, as Don himself could not be located. As a result, Sherrill decided to relocate to a smaller residence in April of 1992, located at 1717 East Delmar Street. By this point, Sherrill was raising Suzie as a single mother, and they maintained a very close relationship. Sherrill was working as a cosmetologist at the New Attitudes hair salon and had over 250 clients, and Suzie was planning to follow in her mother's footsteps by attending cosmetology school. On the evening of June 6th, Suzie officially graduated from Kickapoo High School and planned to celebrate by attending a number of different graduation parties and traveling to Branson, 45 miles away. Suzie and 2 of her friends, Stacy McCall and Janelle Kirby, would spend the night at a hotel before visiting the water park, Whitewater Branson. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, was concerned about this, but at around 10:30 p.m., Stacy phoned Janice up to let her know that they had changed their plans and would now be spending the night at Janelle's house and travel to Branson the following day. At around 11:15 p.m., Sherrill Levitt called a friend of hers from her home. She mentioned that she was painting an armoire and gave no indication that anything was wrong, but this would turn out to be the last time anyone heard from her. After Suzie, Stacy, and Janelle attended a party, which was broken up by the police because of a noise complaint, they decided to retire to Janelle's house. However, since a number of relatives were visiting from out of town to attend Janelle's graduation and staying at her house, Suzie and Stacy thought the place was too crowded. Suzie's mother had just presented her with a new king-size waterbed as her graduation present, so Suzie decided it might be better to spend the night there. Sometime between 2 and 2:15 a.m. on the morning of June 7th, Suzie and Stacy both climbed into their separate vehicles to drive to Suzie's house, but what happened over the course of the next several hours has become one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of the modern era. The plan was for Suzie and Stacy to meet up with Janelle sometime that morning and drive to Branson together, but after Janelle woke up, she called Suzie's residence multiple times and received no answer. So at around 12:30 p.m., Janelle decided to travel over to the house with her boyfriend, Mike Henson. They discovered that the vehicles belonging to all 3 women were still parked outside and the front door was unlocked, but Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy had all inexplicably vanished without a trace. Before Janelle and Mike walked inside, they noticed that the glass globe which surrounded the porch light had shattered, though the light bulb itself was still intact. Janelle asked Mike to sweep up the broken shards of glass from the porch, and he wound up disposing of them in a dumpster across the street. At this point, they were unaware that they had gotten rid of a potentially significant piece of evidence. Even though the 3 women were not inside the house, all of their personal belongings had been left behind, including their 3 purses, which were all piled together next to the steps leading down to Suzie's room. Sherrill's purse contained around $900 in cash, which she had received at work and not yet deposited at the bank, while Stacy's contained migraine medication she always carried with her. And even though Sherrill and Suzie were both chain smokers, their cigarettes and lighters were still there as well. Stacy's shorts were neatly folded and resting on top of her sandals next to the waterbed. Her jewelry was in her shorts pocket. A damp cloth was found in the hamper, which had presumably been used to wash off makeup, and Suzie's jewelry was left on the wash basin. Since the only items of Stacy's clothing which could not be accounted for were her t-shirt and underwear, the evidence seemed to indicate that she had gotten ready for bed before she disappeared. Sherrill's bed appeared to have been slept in, and her eyeglasses were resting on the night table. An open book was also found turned over on the bed, which suggested she had been interrupted while in the middle of reading. 2 slats were found in the blinds in Suzie's room, as if someone had been looking out the window, and the television had also been left on in the living room and was currently playing static. The only sign of life left in the house was the family's Yorkshire Terrier, Cinnamon. When Janelle and Mike first went inside, Cinnamon immediately started lunging and barking at them and seemed quite anxious and agitated. But since there were no sign of forced entry or struggle at the house, Janelle was not immediately concerned. However, while she was there, the phone rang, so Janelle decided to answer it and claimed she heard what were described as disturbing sexual innuendos from an unidentified male caller. Janelle hung up, but the phone immediately rang again, and when she picked up, she heard more sexual innuendos and hung up for the second time. In spite of this, Janelle figured the phone calls were a prank and that the three women would turn up eventually, so she left without contacting the police. Well, after not hearing from her daughter and failing to reach her by phone, Janice McCall finally learned about Stacy's plans to spend the night at Susie's residence and went over there in the early evening. Once again, there was no trace of the three women, and Janice was immediately concerned over the fact that Stacy's purse, clothing, and migraine medication were still there. She decided to contact the police and officially report her daughter missing approximately 16 hours after she was last seen. Right from the outset, Janice had an awful feeling when the police asked her to bring them Stacy's dental records to assist in their investigation. While she was at the house, Janice noticed that there was an unplayed message on the answering machine and decided to listen to it, but wound up inadvertently erasing the message before it could be heard by police. All Janice has ever said is that the message was from a man and sounded quote-unquote strange, but claims she cannot remember the exact contents. While investigators believe the message may have contained a crucial clue, they have stated they do not believe it was connected to the obscene phone calls Janelle received earlier that day. Anyway, by the time police arrived at the residence, they learned that no less than 18 people had frequented the place throughout the day, and unaware of the gravity of the situation, they did a lot of cleaning up and rearranging of items. Much like the disposal of the glass from the broken globe, potential evidence may have unknowingly been destroyed, so it was now impossible to preserve the house as a crime scene. When the three women failed to turn up, a massive missing persons investigation would be launched, and the FBI became involved. Springfield and the surrounding area were extensively searched, and over 20,000 missing posters were put up. One local establishment vowed to never take their poster down until the women were found, and even though the poster is now torn and heavily faded, it's still hung up there all these years later. It wasn't long before a number of eyewitness sightings of the Springfield Three started to filter in. During the early morning hours of June 7th, a woman claimed she was sitting on her front porch to watch the sunrise when she saw a young female matching Susie's description driving an older model moss green Dodge van. This location was 2 miles from Susie's house, and the witness said the van pulled into a nearby driveway. She claimed the driver looked frightened and that she could hear the voice of an unseen male in the back who said, "Don't do anything stupid," and ordered the driver to turn around. The van then backed out of the driveway before heading in the opposite direction. The witness did not immediately contact police and only came forward after recognizing Suzie as the driver she saw. This prompted police to obtain a similar-looking green Dodge van and park it in front of their station in hopes that it might help jog people's memories, and additional witnesses would come forward with sightings of this van. One of them was a man who claimed he saw a blonde woman resembling Suzie sitting in a green van's driver's seat in a grocery store parking lot, and she appeared to be waiting for someone inside. At this point, the man had no knowledge of the Springfield Three's disappearance, but he thought the van looked suspicious and wrote down the license number. Unfortunately, he wound up throwing it away before he contacted the police. They decided to place him under hypnosis to see if he could remember the license number, but he could only recall the first 3 digits. Investigators checked into every registered van in the United States which matched this description, but came up empty, and no one can be certain if the van has any connection to the case. Another eyewitness sighting was provided by a waitress at George's Steakhouse, one of Sherrill's favorite restaurants. According to the waitress, she saw Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy frequenting the restaurant together sometime between 1 and 3 a.m. on June 7th, and they were speaking with what she described as 3 clean-cut men. The waitress said the 3 women all left the restaurant together, and that Suzie was acting giddy and appeared to be intoxicated, while Sherrill was trying to calm her down. However, investigators cannot find anyone else from the restaurant who could corroborate this sighting, so no one can be certain if the women were actually there that night. On June 14th, a search was performed of a local apartment complex after a rough drawing of the building was found at a grocery store on top of a newspaper rack. It contained the phrase, "Use ruse of gas man checking for leak," but the search failed to turn up anything. Investigators started looking at potential suspects. While Sherrill's ex-husbands were cleared, there was some suspicion directed towards her son Bart, with whom she had a troubled relationship. 10 years earlier, Sherrill and Bart had a heated argument about his issues with alcohol, prompting him to move out of their house at the age of 17. In the fall of 1991, following a breakup with his girlfriend, Bart moved into an apartment with his sister Suzie, but the arrangement quickly fell apart, once again due largely to Bart's heavy drinking. After the two siblings got into a physical altercation, brought upon when Suzie complained about Bart playing his music too loud, Suzie moved back in with her mother. Sherrill and Suzie both decided to cut Bart out of their lives, and it was only months later when they went missing. Due to his fractured relationship with his family, Bart was questioned by police, but he had a solid alibi and passed a polygraph, so he was ultimately cleared as a suspect. It turned out that in the year prior to her disappearance, Suzie had been involved in 2 separate relationships which ended badly. One of her ex-boyfriends was Mike Kovacs, whom Suzie had lived with for 3 months, but there were allegations of abuse, and Suzie even took out a temporary restraining order against Mike after he continued to harass and threaten her after their breakup. For his part, Mike claimed that he had not spoken with Suzie since the previous September, and since he passed a polygraph and there was no evidence to implicate him, police did not consider him to be a suspect either. Now, Suzie's relationship with her ex-boyfriend Dustin Rekla was a lot more strange. Believe it or not, their breakup occurred after Suzie learned that Dustin and 2 of his friends, Michael Clay and Joseph Riedel, had participated in an act of grave robbing. The 3 of them broke into a mausoleum at a cemetery on February 21st and stole a skull and some bones before placing them in a tree. They wound up getting caught after Dustin pulled some gold teeth out of the skull and attempted to sell it at a pawn shop. Suzie provided a statement about the vandalism to police to help them get charged, and she was planning to testify when they went on trial in September, but of course, she wound up going missing before this could take place. In the end, the group decided to plead guilty to institutional vandalism and receive probation. Naturally, they were all questioned following Suzie's disappearance, and Michael Clay raised some eyebrows by saying that he, quote-unquote, hoped those bitches were dead. Dustin and Michael claimed they were attending a concert and party together on the night of the disappearances, which was not exactly an airtight alibi, but after they spoke with Terry Knowles, the Springfield police chief at that time, he ruled them out as suspects. However, there is still some controversy about this decision, as to this day, some people who worked on the case have openly stated that Dustin and Michael should not have been cleared. Chief Knowles has always been the subject of criticism for how he handled the investigation, as he was accused by some of being a micromanager who would personally question suspects himself rather than letting his detectives do their jobs. Anyway, the case garnered so much attention that it was featured on such major true crime shows as 48 Hours and America's Most Wanted. On New Year's Eve in 1992, an anonymous male caller phoned the America's Most Wanted hotline and said he had information about the disappearances and asked to speak to the investigators. While the switchboard operator attempted to put him through, the call was disconnected before he could speak to anybody. Authorities believe the caller may have had legitimate information and sent out a public plea asking for him to call back, but he never did. A promising development occurred in August of 1993 when a suspect named Stephen Eugene Garrison was arrested on a weapons charge and said he wanted to make a deal. He told police that he had information about the Springfield Three and that a friend of his had drunkenly confessed to murdering them. Garrison apparently revealed a piece of info which had not been released publicly and showed there might be some truth to his claims, so he was able to get his bond reduced from $10,000 to $2,500 and was released from jail. Unfortunately, while meeting with investigators in a hotel room to discuss the case, Garrison took off and was on the run for 3 weeks. During this time, he broke into the apartment of a 20-year-old university student and sexually assaulted her, which ultimately led to him receiving a 40-year prison sentence. Upon his recapture, Garrison led police to a piece of farmland in Webster County, as he claimed the 3 missing women's bodies were buried there, and that the aforementioned green Dodge van used to abduct them would be found nearby. Years earlier, this property had actually been the site of another horrific crime, as its owner, Francis Lee Robb Sr., was accused of being involved in the murders of 3 people: Mary Susan Thomas, John David Davison, and his brother, Daniel Lee Davison. The murders were the result of a drug deal gone bad, and the victims' bodies were never found because Rob and an accomplice allegedly burned them, placed their ashes in 5-gallon containers, and scattered them throughout the county. In 1990, Rob pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and received 2 life sentences, while his accomplice pled guilty to the 3rd murder. Rob was described by police as one of the meanest men they ever encountered, and he died in prison in 1995. Well, the search of Rob's property did not turn up any trace of the Springfield Three or the green van, but it apparently did turn up a few items. However, since a judge issued a gag order, which prevented law enforcement from speaking to the media about the search, no specific details about what was found have ever been released publicly. The most promising suspect to pop up on the radar in this case is a career criminal and former Army Ranger named Robert Craig Cox. In December of 1978, Cox became the prime suspect in the murder of 19-year-old Sharon Zellers, who was abducted and killed while driving home from her job at Disney World. She was found beaten to death with 14 head wounds inside a sewage lift station located less than 400 feet away from a motel Cox and his parents were staying at. The same night Sharon was murdered, Cox had to be treated at the hospital after returning to his motel room with an inch of his tongue missing. While Cox claimed it had gotten bitten off during a fight, his story could not be corroborated, and it seemed very likely that Sharon had done it while attempting to fight him off. It took a while to build a case against Cox, and he would not go on trial for a decade, by which point he was already serving a 9-year sentence in a California prison for 2 separate incidents from 1985 in which he kidnapped and assaulted 2 separate women who managed to escape from him. He was extradited to Florida, found guilty of Sharon Zeller's murder, and sentenced to death. However, his conviction was overturned by the Florida Supreme Court the following year because they believed the jury did not have enough evidence to convict him. Cox was then extradited back to California to finish serving the remainder of his sentence there, and after he was paroled, he moved to Springfield, Missouri. Cox was first brought to the attention of the authorities from Sharon Zellers' family after they watched a news report about the disappearance of the Springfield Three. At the time, Cox was working in Springfield as a utility line locator, but it turned out he had previously worked as a mechanic at the same auto dealership where Stacy's father, Stu McCall, was employed as a salesman. While Stu did not remember ever meeting Cox, this did provide a tentative connection to the case. Cox was investigated, and he claimed that he had an alibi as he was spending the night at his parents' home on the night the Springfield Three disappeared. While his parents did corroborate this, they were technically sleeping during the approximate time period the women went missing. However, Cox's girlfriend did corroborate his story that he attended church with her later that same morning. There was no evidence to implicate Cox, and he soon moved away from the area, but he wound up getting a second look in 1995 after he was charged with an aggravated robbery in Decatur, Texas, in which he held a gun to the head of a 12-year-old girl. As a result, Cox wound up receiving consecutive 35 and 15-year prison sentences, and he is not eligible for parole until 2025. During this time, grand jury proceedings were held in the Springfield Three case, and Cox's former girlfriend recanted her story that he had been at the church with her on the morning of the disappearances, testifying that Cox had told her to say that and lie to the police. Cox would once again be questioned by investigators and shared a new story with a reporter from the Springfield News Leader. While Cox never admitted to being personally involved, he now claimed that all 3 of the women were murdered and that Sherrill was the intended target, while Suzie and Stacy were in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said their remains were very nearby, but would never be found. But as far as I can tell, Cox never shared any information to indicate that he may have had inside knowledge of the crime, so authorities are unsure if he was actually involved or is just making up false stories in order to garner attention. Cox has always refused to take a polygraph and refused all further requests to be re-interviewed, claiming that his questioning from police has caused him to be segregated from his fellow inmates. Cox has also stated that he would never reveal any more details about what happened to the Springfield Three until his mother passes away, and at the time of this recording, she is still alive and in her 80s. In 1997, Sherrill and Suzie's surviving relatives had them declared legally deceased, but Stacy's family stated that they would not do the same thing until her body was found. That same year, a bench would be dedicated to the 3 missing women in the Victims' Memorial Garden of Springfield's Phelps Grove Park. For over 20 years, the McCall family ran a non-profit organization called One Missing Link, which sought to bring awareness to missing persons cases just like theirs, though they ultimately had to close their doors due to a combination of health and funding problems. But there would be one more development which has dominated this case during the past decade. In 2006, a crime reporter / independent investigator named Kathy Baird informed police that she had received tips that the remains of the Springfield Three were buried in the concrete foundation of the parking garage at a local hospital, which, coincidentally enough, is named Cox South Hospital. Baird also invited Rick Norland, a mechanical engineer who had previously worked at Ground Zero in New York City following 9/11, to scan a corner of this parking garage with ground-penetrating radar. Norland claimed that he detected 3 anomalies, 2 of which were parallel and 1 perpendicular, and he believed they were roughly the same size as a grave containing 3 bodies. After investigating this lead, police came to the conclusion that the information was not credible, citing the fact that construction on the parking garage did not even begin until September of 1993, 15 months after the Springfield Three went missing. So as of right now, a dig has yet to be performed of the parking garage. Over the past 27 years, investigators have received over 5,000 tips, and a $42,000 reward has been offered for information, but in spite of this, no trace of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall has ever been found, and the disappearance of the Springfield Three continues to remain a baffling unsolved mystery. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Now, you can definitely understand why this mystery strikes such a chord with people and has become one of the most heavily discussed missing persons cases of all time, because it involves 3 individuals who practically vanished into thin air. I'm always haunted by cases in which multiple people go missing at the same time, but this one is particularly remarkable because 3 women just disappeared from a house in the middle of the night in what was most likely an abduction. But even though you'd assume this would be a difficult task to accomplish, there was virtually no evidence to shed any light on what happened. The only evidence which pointed to an outside intruder was a broken globe from the porch light, but even that caused extra confusion, because why would an intruder destroy that particular item? This is also a case in which there have been a number of potential suspects, but there really is no concrete evidence specifically pointing to anyone. And the whole situation is further complicated by the fact that 2 of the missing victims had not even planned to spend the night at the house to begin with, and only decided to do so at the last minute. So who was the intended target here? This is an especially tragic and frustrated situation for the family of Stacy McCall, since she may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her mother, Janice, has always been a tireless advocate for the case, and during interviews, she often talks about how concerned she was about the idea of Stacy spending the night at a hotel in Branson, but then breathed a sigh of relief when Stacy called her up and said she would be sleeping over at Janelle Kirby's house instead. But then yet another cruel twist of fate happened when Stacy and Suzie decided that Janelle's house was too overcrowded, so they went to Suzie's house instead. If Sherrill was the perpetrator's intended target all along, then Suzie and Stacy came this close to avoiding whatever happened. In 2011, this case was profiled on an episode of the true crime TV show Disappeared, and during Janice's interview, it was pretty heartbreaking to hear her say that Stacy has now officially been missing for longer than she had her. But now that we're on the subject of Disappeared, we need to talk about the infamous hospital parking garage theory, as I think we should get it out of the way before anything else. The last section of the Disappeared episode is devoted to exploring that theory, and it ends with talk that the Springfield police chief was considering the idea of digging up the garage, though this ultimately never came to fruition. Of course, some people have always expressed anger and frustration over the police's unwillingness to do this, but personally, I think the fact that it was featured on Disappeared has given the parking garage theory more credibility than it deserves. You see, a lot of people don't realize that the whole tip about this theory originated from a poster from the Web Sleuths forum named Ken, who claimed that a psychic vision of the ghost of Stacy McCall told him that the bodies were buried underneath the parking garage at Cox South Hospital. No, seriously, that's how this whole thing got started. I don't know if this is nothing more than a coincidence, but I have to wonder if there's some significance to the fact that Cox South Hospital just happens to share the same name as one of the primary suspects in this case, Robert Craig Cox. Maybe that particular hospital was named as a burial site for a reason. Now, many accounts state that investigators received multiple tips about this theory from different sources, but it's been theorized that most of them came from people who heard Ken's story from various forums and message boards and decided to bombard the police with it, even though they had no hard information to support their claims. The theory gained more traction when Rick Norland used ground-penetrating radar to detect the anomalies under the garage, but police have claimed they consulted with their own expert who discounted the findings. The biggest argument against this theory is that construction on the parking garage did not actually start until over a year after the Springfield Three went missing, though the counter-argument to that is that the area was nothing but a dirt lot in June of 1992, so theoretically, someone could have buried the bodies there before the garage was subsequently built over them. However, authorities claim that the ground would have been excavated before construction began and likely turned up any bodies. As you probably know, I'm a frequent poster at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, and there's a running gag there that whenever the parking garage theory is mentioned, someone will inevitably type paging Max Trollbot. Long story short, Max Trollbot is a poster there who has done extensive research into the Springfield Three case and the construction of the Cox South Hospital parking garage, and will never miss an opportunity to write extensive posts which tear apart this theory. There are also a lot of interesting exchanges in those threads between Max and a former construction worker who debunks the idea that human bodies can be buried in concrete foundations, as the structural integrity would be severely compromised. When a body starts to decay, it will create an air pocket which weakens the integrity of the concrete, so if a car was to drive over the spot in the garage where the three bodies were buried, the ground would probably collapse. And even if that didn't happen, there would eventually be a structural void created by the decay, leading to the appearance of a body-sized hole. Not to mention the fact that the ground has to be prepped before concrete is even poured, so if three bodies were there, there's a very strong chance someone would have noticed. Even if you dismiss all these problems, burying the bodies at that specific location wouldn't make any logical sense. Even though Springfield is a sizable city which had a population of over 140,000 people at that time, it is pretty much surrounded by nothing but rural area for miles. That means there are plenty of isolated locations to dispose of three bodies where you could ensure no one would ever find them, so why risk doing so at a spot in the middle of the city? Now, to be fair, searching for the bodies would not require them to dig up the entire garage, as a core sample could be obtained by drilling through the concrete and using a camera to see what the anomalies might be, a process which would not be that costly. If there is no sign of any bodies under there, then no digging would be required. Janice McCall has openly said that while she does not believe her daughter is buried under the parking garage, she would support an excavation so they can be 100% sure. Regardless, it appears that law enforcement will not perform a thorough search without more convincing evidence. The biggest proponent of this parking garage theory has always been Kathy Baird, but I think there are definitely some credibility issues with her. In 2017, this case was profiled on the TV show Crime Watch Daily, and Baird's interview led to one of the most awkward moments I've ever seen on a true crime show. Baird claims she knows exactly what happened to the Springfield Three, but will not talk about it, so the show's producer flat out confronts her and asks why she is doing this interview in the first place if she doesn't want to share what she knows. Baird then talks about how her life has been threatened and she's been advised to leave this case alone, but again, if you feel your life is at risk, why agree to appear on national television to begin with? Baird has written on a blog that a shoebox containing 2 rings, which belonged to the missing women, were found inside a Springfield house, and that police are refusing to perform DNA testing on them, but I can't find any official source that corroborates this, which is why I'm pretty skeptical. I have a gut feeling that the police might have some sort of information, which they've never publicly shared, that's made them 100% convinced there's nothing underneath the garage. While I would not object if the police finally decided to go through with obtaining a core sample to settle this once and for all, I am inclined to think this entire lead has been a waste of time, so let's move on to discussing the other aspects of this case. One of the biggest obstacles to figuring out what happened is that we don't know the exact time the women went missing from the house, so there's a window of around 6 hours or so when this could have occurred. Suzie and Stacy were last seen when they left Janelle Kirby's house sometime between 2 and 2:15 a.m., and Janelle started calling Suzie's house sometime around 8 a.m. and received no answer, so the three women were presumably gone by that point. And it should also be mentioned that the last confirmed sighting of Sherrill was at around 11:15 p.m. the previous night, when she completed a phone call with her friend. You could easily assume that Sherrill was the target all along, and whoever was responsible for the disappearances was expecting her to be home alone the entire night, and perhaps they were already inside the house when Suzie and Stacy surprised everyone by unexpectedly arriving. However, the evidence strongly suggests that everything was normal at first when the two girls got back there, because they had removed their makeup and jewelry, and Stacy's shorts were on the floor, which implies that she had gotten ready for bed. The presence of an open book on Sherrill's bed also might suggest that she was still awake and reading when Suzie and Stacy arrived. On the other hand, there was a sighting of the three women by a waitress at George's Steakhouse between 1 and 3 a.m., so theoretically, after Suzie and Stacy got back home and met up with Sherrill, the three of them could have decided to go out for a bite to eat, and whatever happened to them occurred after they went back home and got ready for bed. The waitress remembered seeing them talk with three men, and while I have no idea who they might have been, I guess it's possible that these guys could have followed the women back to their house and did them harm. But I am inclined to think that this was a mistaken sighting, especially since no one else from the restaurant could corroborate the waitress's story. It's likely she saw another group of women there at that time, or Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy had visited the restaurant together on a previous occasion and the waitress got the dates mixed up. Of course, the other major sighting from that same period of time was provided by a woman who thought she saw Stacy driving a green Dodge van around sunrise, and this van became such a major lead in the investigation that it led to even more eyewitness sightings. The witness described hearing a voice from an unseen male telling the female driver, "Don't do anything stupid," and instructing her to turn the van around. But if the driver was Suzie, it's always struck me as odd that her abductor would have her drive the getaway vehicle. If this sighting is legitimate, then you'd have to assume that Sherrill and Stacy were tied up in the back of the van and that perhaps her abductor was threatening them in order to force Suzie to drive them somewhere. I know it's not uncommon for kidnapping victims to be carjacked by someone who forced them to drive to another location in their own vehicle, but I'm not sure how common it is for victims to be forced to drive their kidnapper's vehicle somewhere. It seems rather risky to put your captive behind the wheel of a vehicle they've never driven before, but perhaps these were extraordinary circumstances. If one person was responsible for the abduction of three women, he may have felt that he wouldn't have been able to control them if he drove the van himself and kept all three victims tied up in the back, so he decided it was necessary to watch over two of them in the back while Suzie drove. But still, even though the witness thought the situation with the van looked suspicious, she didn't think it was suspicious enough to immediately call the police. It was only after learning about the Springfield Three's disappearance in the media that she began to think the blonde woman she saw was Suzie and decided to come forward. I don't know, unless the van's windows were down, I'm not exactly sure how this witness could have heard a man's voice giving instructions to the driver, particularly if she couldn't even see him. But if her story is true, it's possible she saw a completely innocuous moment which suddenly became a lot more sinister once she learned that three women went missing from the area. The police did a really thorough job at exploring all registered green Dodge vans in the US and came up empty, so it's possible it was nothing more than a false lead. I do think that the other tips generated by this lead, such as the man who thought he saw Suzie sitting inside a green van outside a grocery store, were mistaken sightings, so I think there's a good chance the van has no significance. But if the Springfield Three were not abducted inside that van, how were they abducted? Well, a number of people believe that multiple individuals were involved in this crime, as it would have been very difficult for one person to abduct 3 women from a house at the same time. But if the perpetrator had a gun, they could have convinced the women to do anything they said. Given that there were no signs of any struggle, it would not surprise me at all if someone forced Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy to quietly walk out of the house at gunpoint and climb into a vehicle. Even if the aforementioned green van has no connection to the crime, it would not surprise me if a van was used, since it would have been more difficult to keep them all restrained inside a car. But who was the intended target here? Well, I've already mentioned the idea that the perpetrator was after Sherrill and was not expecting the 2 girls to be at the house that night. But since Suzie and Stacy spent the night attending multiple parties, it's also possible someone followed them home before making their move. Since the resident's front door was unlocked and there were no signs of any forced entry, this seems to indicate that the women willingly opened the door for someone, or it was never even locked to begin with. Even though the house was located in a pretty decent neighborhood, I'm not sure it was safe enough that anyone living there wouldn't bother locking their doors, especially when you consider that Suzie had recently gone through 2 problematic breakups with 2 ex-boyfriends during the preceding year. However, it's certainly possible that after a night of partying, Suzie could have simply forgotten to lock the door behind her after she returned home. But if the door was locked, what could have compelled them to open it in the middle of the night? Now, this is a case in which people have uttered the phrase, "if only dogs could talk." Sherrill and Suzie's pet terrier, Cinnamon, was left behind at the house, and judging by the way he was acting when Janelle and Mike arrived, I'd say there's a good chance he witnessed exactly what happened to the 3 women. There's actually been a theory put forward that perhaps Cinnamon was used to allow an intruder to gain access to the house. If Cinnamon had been left out in the yard that night, the perpetrator could have grabbed the dog, knocked on the front door, and claimed they had rescued Cinnamon after he wandered away. If this ruse was convincing enough, it may have compelled one of the women to open the front door. Other ruses which have been proposed are that the perpetrator impersonated a police officer, or perhaps was a police officer. And there was also the drawing found at the grocery store days later containing the phrase, "Use ruse of gas man checking for leak." So maybe someone lured the victims out of the house by telling them there was a gas leak. Of course, the one thing that has always left everyone completely perplexed about this case is the broken globe for the porch light, which might be one of the strangest details ever associated with an unsolved cold case. It would be one thing if the entire light was broken, but the fact that someone seemed to go to the trouble of removing the globe and left the light bulb intact is just bizarre. It's possible the perpetrator was trying to quietly remove the entire porch light, but wound up accidentally dropping the globe and breaking it, or perhaps this was intentional and they wanted to make a loud noise to lure the women outside onto the porch. Whatever the case, if whoever removed the globe left their fingerprints on the glass, then it's a major shame that Janelle and Mike cleaned up the glass and threw all the pieces away before the police could check them. Some people have read a lot into these actions, creating suspicion that perhaps Janelle and Mike knew more than they were letting on and deliberately disposed of evidence. But I really believe that it was probably nothing more than an honest mistake, and they just did not understand the ramifications of what they were doing at the time, as who knew this was going to blow up into such a major missing persons case. It's the same thing with the 18 people who traipsed through the house throughout the day, rearranging items and cleaning things up, not realizing that this was a potential crime scene. Remember, we were still many years away from the CSI era, so most of the general public was not aware of the significance of preserving evidence. From today's perspective, some people might find it weird that Janelle Kirby and Janice McCall would just walk into someone else's house when the door was unlocked, and even go so far as to answer their phone and listen to messages on the answering machine. But this was long before the era of cell phones and instant communication, so if someone was missing and you just couldn't get a hold of them, you'd probably try anything you could to figure out where they were. I don't know if there's any significance to those obscene, sexually explicit phone calls Janelle claims she received at the house, as they may have been nothing more than prank calls, but if it was the perpetrator, it's possible they were calling the house to find out if anyone would answer, in order to gauge if the women's disappearances have been noticed yet. It's always struck me as odd that when Janice heard the message on the answering machine later that day, which was inadvertently erased, she described it as quote-unquote strange, but also said that she couldn't remember the exact contents of the message. Part of me wonders if Janice does know what was specifically on the message, but the police have asked her not to reveal that information publicly, which is why she claims she can't remember. A question which is always asked is if phone records were ever checked to see where the obscene calls and answering machine message originated from. Given how diligently the police have investigated this case, I'm sure they probably explored that angle, and while we are talking about 1992 technology, they were still capable of tracing phone calls back then. So I'm guessing this lead either turned up nothing, or perhaps the police did turn up something which they've chosen to withhold from the public. Remember, police have stated that they don't believe the answering machine message and the phone calls Janelle received are connected, but they've never specified why, so there must be some reason they came to that conclusion. Now, one of the murkiest elements of this case is figuring out the potential motive. For years, there have been uncorroborated rumors that Sherrill or Suzie were targeted because they were involved in drugs. Shortly after the disappearances took place, this case was profiled on 48 Hours, and you can actually watch the episode on YouTube. It actually features an interview with an anonymous informant whose face is obscured, and he claims that Sherrill had a drug debt, and he goes so far as to point the finger at an alleged cocaine dealer. But this man denied any involvement in the disappearances, claiming he didn't even know the three women, and he denied even being a cocaine dealer to begin with. He ultimately wound up passing a polygraph when questioned by police. In spite of all these rumors, it doesn't sound like they've ever turned up any hard evidence that any of these three women were involved in drugs, and if they have, they've never revealed it publicly. One of the biggest issues I've had with the drug theory is that it doesn't appear like anything was stolen from the house. A lot of people have found it weird that all three of the women's purses were lined up together next to the steps leading down into Suzie's room. It would make sense for the two girls' purses to be there, but why was Sherrill's purse next to theirs? This suggests that someone may have grabbed all the purses and was searching through them, possibly to look for drugs. But on the other hand, Sherrill's purse still had $900 in cash inside. Even if robbery was not the primary motive, it seems strange that someone who looked through that purse wouldn't take the opportunity to help themselves to $900, especially if they were involved in drugs. That is the main reason I'm skeptical that drugs played any role in these disappearances, and why I'm compelled to believe that the crime was sexually motivated and that whoever was responsible wanted to harm one or more of the women inside that house. So now would be an opportune time to look at all the potential suspects. For starters, we'll talk about Sherrill's son and Suzie's brother, Bart Streeter, who has pretty much been completely ruled out. But Bart is a tragic figure because he had such a strained relationship with his mother and sister that they pretty much decided to cut him out of their lives, but before there was an opportunity for a potential reconciliation, the two women vanished without a trace months later. To his credit, it seems like Bart did manage to overcome his issues with alcohol and turn his life around. He's become an advocate for Sherrill and Suzie and runs a blog dedicated to their disappearances. And when he was interviewed on the Disappeared episode about the case, you could tell the circumstances of how they went missing still haunt him. Interestingly enough, if you watch the old 48 Hours episode, they show some brief footage of Bart and Suzie's estranged father, Brent Streeter, whom police took a while to track down before he could be questioned. Brent becomes angry when the 48 Hours camera crew shows up at his doorstep to interview him, and it's clear that he had not been a part of his family's lives for a long time. But believe it or not, one of the first things Brent did when questioned by police is point suspicion towards his own son, which I'm sure made Bart feel terrific, considering that his father was the only immediate family he had left. Anyway, while Brent doesn't sound like a particularly sympathetic figure, neither he nor Sherrill's other ex-husband, Don Levitt, were ever considered serious suspects. So now let's discuss Suzie's former boyfriends, Mike Kovacs and Dustin Rekla, whom she both had rocky relationships with, to say the least. Suzie and Mike had a rough time living together for a few months the previous year, and she had to take out a temporary restraining order against him, but while it would be tempting to think that Mike was a promising suspect, it sounds like he was cleared. But there's a bit more uncertainty with Dustin Rekla. I mean, as if this case wasn't strange enough already, we have an ex-boyfriend of one of the victims who liked to participate in grave robberies and pawn off gold teeth found inside the skulls. I know that many sources, including the Disappeared episode, put some emphasis on the fact that Dustin and his friends had an interest in the occult, which kind of makes me roll my eyes, since it sounds dangerously close to the satanic panic which was prevalent during the 80s and early 90s, so I don't put much stock into that at all. But given that the grave robbing incident prompted Suzie to break up with Dustin, and she was planning to testify against him at his trial, there was definitely a potential motive here, especially when his friend, Michael Clay, flat out told police he hoped the women were dead. Even though Dustin and his accomplices were cleared as suspects by the chief of police, some investigators still believed that decision was premature and that they should not have been ruled out. But in the end, there was not even a trial to begin with, as Dustin and his friends ultimately pled guilty to institutional vandalism and received probation. So even if Suzie did live long enough to testify, it doesn't sound like the punishment would have been that severe and worth murdering someone over. Of course, dumb kids who commit grave robbery are not going to be the most rational people in the world, so I could see a scenario where they show up at Suzie's house in the middle of the night with the intention of scaring her, but things escalate so out of control that Suzie, Stacy, and Sherrill all wind up dead. But again, these were dumb kids, and this was essentially the perfect crime, so I seriously doubt that Dustin and his friends would have been capable of murdering 3 women, disposing of their bodies, and covering their tracks so well that they left no evidence behind. I really don't think that Dustin, Michael Clay, and Joseph Riedel had any involvement, as the circumstances of the disappearance make me think that whoever was responsible had to be a hardcore criminal. So let's look at some of these suspects. One person who has been the subject of some speculation is Gerald Carnahan, a Springfield resident who is currently serving a life sentence for the 1985 rape and murder of 20-year-old Jackie Johns, whose body was dumped in Lake Springfield. Carnahan was not actually convicted of this crime until 2007 after a DNA match, but he previously spent 2 years in prison for attempting to kidnap an 18-year-old girl in March of 1993, 9 months after the Springfield Three went missing. Carnahan certainly fits the profile of someone who would commit a crime like this, and there seemed to be a lot of uncorroborated rumors online that Sherrill Levitt dated him at one point, or that she cut his hair at her salon. But this mostly seems like nothing more than local gossip, as there's nothing that conclusively links Carnahan to this case. It does not seem like Sherrill was in a relationship with anyone at all at the time she went missing, as it sounds like she was more focused on raising her daughter, remodeling her new home, and building relationships with her clients. Given that he was living in Springfield at that time, and has a history of harming young women, it's certainly possible Carnahan could have crossed paths with Sherrill at some point and been responsible for these disappearances, but without any definitive evidence, I can't say for sure. Another person who has popped up on the radar as a potential suspect is Larry Dwayne Hall. I've previously covered 2 unsolved missing persons cases on this podcast in which Hall was mentioned as a possible suspect: the disappearances of Angela Hammond and Tracy Crow. Hall is currently serving a life sentence for the 1993 kidnapping and death of a 15-year-old girl named Jessica Roach, but some people believe he is a serial killer who might be responsible for the disappearances and deaths of as many as 40 women. Since his incarceration, Hall has confessed to the murders of at least 2 other missing young women, but their bodies have never been found, so officially, no other murders have ever been linked to him. However, author Christopher Hawley Martin has published a book titled Urges, a Chronicle of Serial Killer Larry Hall, and Hall has told him that he buried 5 female victims in Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. He claims that 2 of the victims were from small towns he couldn't remember the names of, but the other 3 were from Springfield, so naturally, the first case people think of is the Springfield Three. Now, even though he lived in Indiana, one of Hall's hobbies was traveling the country and performing in Civil War reenactment groups. It was established that Larry and his twin brother Gary were in the Springfield area during the summer of 1991 to participate in the 130th anniversary reenactment of the Battle of Wilson's Creek, and one of their family members seemed to think they visited the area again in the summer of 1992. Since it's been suspected that multiple people were involved in the abduction of the Springfield Three, some have wondered if perhaps Larry and Gary could have pulled off this crime together, though it should be mentioned that Gary has never officially been tied to any crimes. Now, what's interesting is that Larry Dwayne Hall allegedly purchased a blue Dodge van in Indianapolis in July of 1991, and when he was arrested in 1994, he was driving a brown and tan van. While the sighting of the green van dominated the Springfield Three case, a lead which didn't get as much attention was provided by one of their neighbors, who told police they saw a dirty white van cruising the neighborhood in the 3 weeks prior to the disappearance. The driver was described as being a white male in his mid-20s to mid-30s who had prominent sideburns and a mane of brown hair pulled away from his face. Well, because of his participation in Civil War reenactments, Larry Dwayne Hall had very large, prominent sideburns. Of course, that in itself does not prove that Hall abducted the three women, or that he was even in Springfield in June of 1992, but he certainly sounds like the type of person who would have been capable of a crime like this. Hall has stated that he would lead police to the burial sites in Mark Twain National Forest in exchange for immunity for his other crimes, but as we're going to discuss soon, criminals serving lengthy prison sentences often have no qualms about toying with police and taking credit for crimes they did not commit, so thus far, investigators do not seem to believe Hall's claims are credible enough to take him up on his offer. While I can't say there's strong evidence pointing to Hall as the perpetrator, I wouldn't completely rule him out either. So now let's explore the information provided by Stephen Eugene Garrison in August of 1993, as he claimed he heard a friend drunkenly confess to the murders of the Springfield Three and that their remains were buried on a piece of property in Webster County. Now, given the circumstances of what happened with Garrison, there's good reason to be skeptical of him. After he gets arrested for another crime, he suddenly starts claiming that he has information about the area's most famous cold case, which he wants to use as a bargaining chip. And sadly, this ploy led to Garrison getting his bond reduced and gave him the opportunity to go free and commit a brutal sexual assault on a young woman, which is a pretty tragic side story in this case. But overall, it seems like Garrison did provide some information which sounded credible enough that it compelled police to search the property. We know they found a few items, but the gag order has prevented them from revealing what they were. Now, I mentioned earlier that this property was previously owned by Francis Lee Robb Sr., who went to prison for the brutal drug-related murders of 3 people. Since he was already incarcerated by the time the Springfield Three went missing, we know Robb had no direct involvement in their disappearances, but there have been rumors that the case might be connected to the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club, an outlaw biker gang that both Robb and Garrison were associated with. Since this gang was believed to be heavily involved in drugs, this has once again fueled rumors that the Springfield Three's disappearance was drug-related, and I know there used to be extensive discussions about this on the Topics forums. Of course, I've mentioned on this podcast many times before that you should take everything you read on the Topics forums with a huge grain of salt, since it's filled with unsubstantiated rumors and gossip. Since these forums were permanently shut down a few months before this recording, I never got the opportunity to peruse their threads about the Springfield Three, but I'm not sure how much credence I would put into any of the rumors about a biker gang being the perpetrators. Because of the gag order, I really can't comment on whether the property in Webster County has any relevance to this case, but the fact that they issued a gag order to begin with shows that there might be some substance to it. I do find it interesting that while investigators have openly expressed their skepticism about the theory involving the hospital parking garage, they continue to remain silent on this particular lead, which gives me the impression that they have not completely ruled it out. Stephen Eugene Garrison is another bad dude who strikes me as someone who would have been capable of committing a crime like this, but it doesn't sound like police have uncovered any evidence to suggest he was personally involved. And lastly, we have to talk about Robert Craig Cox, the suspect who is most closely associated with this case. Cox is clearly a psychopath, and in spite of the Florida Supreme Court overturning his death sentence for the murder of Sharon Zellers, pretty much everyone still believes he was actually guilty of that crime. If Cox did murder the Springfield Three, then this adds an extra level of tragedy to their story, since he technically never should have been free to do them harm to begin with. It's worth mentioning that during his time on death row, Cox crossed paths with none other than Ted Bundy and developed a fascination with him, and it's easy to see some similarities in their personalities. Like Bundy, Cox is an incredibly smarmy guy who seems to love toying with the police and garnering attention. He'll tell police just enough to make them think he has knowledge of a particular crime, but not enough to directly incriminate himself. Cox has claimed that he knows what happened to the Springfield Three and where the remains are buried, but he never actually admits to being responsible or clarifies how he would know this information if he wasn't personally involved in the crime. There's definitely a good chance that Cox is completely full of it and knows nothing at all about this case, but given that he was living in Springfield at the time it happened, he cannot be overlooked as a suspect. The most compelling connection is that Cox once worked at the same car dealership as Stacy's father, Stu McCall, and while there's no indication the two men ever met, Stacy did visit her father at the dealership on occasion, so Cox could have easily seen her at one point and developed a fixation on her. While there have been a number of potential suspects who might have had a motive to harm Suzie or Sherrill, that has never been the case with Stacy. She seemed to be very well liked and didn't have any known enemies, did not live at the house where the crime took place, and only decided to sleep over there at the last minute. But if someone had been following her on that particular night, they might have decided this was an ideal opportunity to make their move. Another good reason to be suspicious of Cox is his shaky alibi. While Cox's parents claimed that he spent the night at their house, it sounds like they would have been sleeping during the approximate time period the three women would have gone missing, so how can they account for his whereabouts the entire time? And of course, while Cox's girlfriend provided him with an alibi that they were at church together that morning, she later recanted and claimed that Cox told her to say that. But the question I've always had is, does it really make any difference whether Cox was at church that morning or not? I mean, the last confirmed sightings of Suzie and Stacy took place shortly after 2 a.m., so unless Cox was attending church in the middle of the night, that really doesn't give him an alibi. I don't know the exact time Cox claimed he was at church, but let's just say it was 8 or 9 a.m. that morning. This still gives Cox several hours to abduct the three women and dispose of their bodies, so I don't understand how this alibi was supposed to clear him in the first place. Of course, if Cox really did ask his girlfriend to lie to the police for him, that is pretty suspicious, but it also seems like a rather pointless thing to do. I find it interesting that Cox worked as a utility line locator at that time. Not only would this job have given him the opportunity to scout the house beforehand without looking suspicious, but it might have been useful at convincing one of the women to open the door in the middle of the night. I mentioned earlier that a drawing was found in a grocery store containing the sentence, "Use ruse of gas man checking for leak." While Cox didn't work for the gas company, if he was wearing his utilities company uniform and was able to convince the occupants of the house that there was a gas leak and they needed to open the door immediately, they probably wouldn't have known the difference. Given that Cox had already kidnapped and murdered a young woman in Florida and attempted to kidnap 2 other girls in California who managed to get away from him, he definitely seems like someone who would have targeted Suzie or Stacy. However, if he was following either of them that night, he would have known they were inside the house together, and was he really brazen enough to abduct multiple people at the same time? After all, he had already gone to prison for abducting 2 girls who managed to get away from him. A lot of people believe that more than one perpetrator was involved in this crime, but as far as I know, Cox never worked with an accomplice. I don't know. The problem with conclusively believing that Cox is the perpetrator is that even though he can be placed in the Springfield area at that time, he has a small link to one of the victims, and he allegedly got his girlfriend to lie about his alibi. There is no direct evidence against him, and it doesn't sound like he's ever provided any specific information to suggest he might have inside knowledge. Compare that with Stephen Eugene Garrison, who has his own credibility issues, but apparently did provide at least some information which wasn't public knowledge, which is why police were compelled to follow up on the lead he provided. While Cox does have a lengthy prison sentence, he will get his first opportunity for parole in 2025, which is only 6 years away, so as long as there's a small chance he could walk free someday, I don't think he's going to say anything to incriminate himself. And just call it a hunch, but I have a feeling that even when Cox's mother passes away, he is not going to live up to his promise and reveal everything he knows. So overall, I'm on the fence about Cox's involvement, but of course the obvious issue is, if Cox wasn't actually responsible for these disappearances, then who was? Well, that will always be one of the most frustrating elements of this case, because even though we're only a few months away from the 27-year anniversary, there still isn't any strong evidence which implicates a particular suspect. In fact, there's just very little evidence, period, and as a result, it's really difficult to come up with a solid theory about what might have happened. Personally, it would not surprise me at all if the real perpetrator or perpetrators have yet to even show up on the radar. If there's one victim from that house who seemed like the most likely candidate to be a target, it would probably be Suzie, as she had some troubled relationships with ex-boyfriends and ran with a bit of a rougher crowd, so she easily could have encountered someone who wanted to do her harm. While Sherrill did not seem to have any major enemies, she did have over 250 clients at her hair salon, so it's possible that one of them became fixated on her, even if they did not raise any obvious alarm bells. There doesn't seem to be anyone from Stacy's personal life who might have had a motive to harm her, but the fact of the matter is that both her and Suzie spent the evening at multiple parties and crossed paths with numerous people, so they could have drawn the eye of any one of them who decided to follow the two girls to Susie's residence. However, the fact that this crime was professionally done, and the perpetrator managed to abduct 3 women without leaving any evidence behind, tells me this is not the first time they've done something like this, and that they may have had previous experience abducting and murdering women and disposing of their bodies. In a way, I do hope the perpetrator is one of the aforementioned suspects, such as Robert Craig Cox or Larry Dwayne Hall or Gerald Carnahan, because that means they're already incarcerated and cannot harm anyone else. But of course the problem is that once they're behind bars and have nothing left to lose, incarcerated murderers like this love to toy with people, so if any of them do have knowledge of the Springfield Three, it might not be easy to compel them to share the full truth. If you ever visit Reddit, you'll often find threads about the topic, which cases do you believe will never be solved? And unfortunately, I often see the Springfield Three mentioned on those lists. Because even though it's such a high-profile case, and there have been a number of leads over the past 2 decades, it doesn't seem like investigators are any closer to solving this than they were in 1992. And unlike a lot of the other major cold cases which have been solved over the past year or so, there isn't any real DNA evidence to link to anybody. As you know, so many people passed through the house and contaminated the crime scene before police had a chance to investigate, so trying to determine whose DNA was or wasn't supposed to be there would be next to impossible. It seems like the one thing which might be required to close this case is for someone to come forward with verifiable information which can lead to a conclusion. Remember, there's still a $40,000 reward for information, so if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, a.k.a. the Springfield Three, please contact the Springfield Police Department at 417-864-1810. That's 417-864-1810. Anyway, another special thanks to Anna Long for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. Like I mentioned in the intro, this has become a popular recurring monthly contest as so many of our listeners want to win the opportunity to do the same thing. If you've already entered this contest before, you are already eligible for my next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you want to enter and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that the Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. Last month, we released an episode about a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries, the controversial conviction of Larry Race for the murder of his wife, Debbie Race. We're planning to release another exclusive bonus episode this month, which is related to our 3-year anniversary, So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, and they are Dominic W., Mairead O., Tasha C., Kay, Ritka, and Jennifer T. Thank you all so much for your support. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, and of course, the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. They've got a number of interesting threads about the Springfield Three, particularly when it comes to debunking the parking garage theory, so feel free to peruse them for more information. Of course, I need to provide a big thanks to my 2 collaborators who have worked with me on this podcast these past 3 years. Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles these shows together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes our eerie music score. I could not do this podcast without them. Anyway, I also wanted to announce that for the 3rd consecutive year, I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, which is being held at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans from June 7th to the 9th. And 1 month after that, I will also be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July 11th. I think as a measure of how far our podcast has gone, that I'm traveling to 2 separate events within the course of a month. It's been great getting the opportunity to meet so many of my listeners at these various events, and I definitely hope to meet many more of you. It goes without saying that these past 3 years have been such an amazing ride for The Trail Went Cold, and one of the best elements of this podcast's success has been the opportunity to meet so many new and interesting people, both podcasters and listeners alike. But we never would have gotten here without your support, so thank you all so much for making The Trail Went Cold what it is today. We've got a number of great things planned for the year ahead, so have yourself a good week, and once again, join me next Wednesday for our first brand new episode of Year 4 of The Trail Went Cold.